The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of San Francisco International Airport's Terminal 3, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Among the bustling crowd of travelers, a woman in her mid-30s walked quietly toward Gate 58, pulling a sleek carry-on bag. She wore a simple but elegant black blazer over dark jeans, her curly hair neatly tied back in a professional bun. As the CEO of one of the world's leading tech companies, she preferred to keep a low profile while traveling. No entourage, no flashy accessories, just her laptop bag and the latest version of her company's smartphone prototype tucked in her pocket. Most people wouldn't guess that she was worth billions or that her face regularly appeared in business magazines. The boarding process for Flight 2187 to New York had already begun when she reached the gate. A group of passengers huddled around the counter, some frantically reorganizing their carry-ons, others tapping away at their phones. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker, now boarding first-class passengers and our elite members. She stepped forward, boarding pass and ID in hand. The gate agent smiled warmly, scanned her ticket, and wished her a pleasant flight. Everything seemed normal until she stepped onto the plane. The senior flight attendant, a woman with graying blonde hair and a tight smile, stood at the entrance greeting passengers. "Welcome aboard," she beamed at the businessman in front of our CEO, gesturing him toward the first-class cabin. But when the tech executive stepped forward, the attendant's smile vanished, replaced by a look of thinly veiled suspicion. "Your boarding pass?" the attendant demanded, despite having just watched her walk straight from the gate. The CEO calmly presented it, along with her ID, something she noticed wasn't being asked of other first-class passengers. "Economy is toward the back," the attendant said automatically, barely glancing at the documents. "I'm in 2A, the CEO replied softly, pointing to her first-class boarding pass. The attendant's eyes narrowed as she double-checked the ticket, her lips pursing into a tight line. After a long moment, she stepped aside, making no attempt to hide her skepticism. As our CEO made her way to her seat, she couldn't help but notice the stark difference in how the flight attendant greeted the passengers behind her, all warm smiles and helpful offers to assist with bags. She settled into her spacious first-class seat, stowing her carry-on in the overhead compartment herself, though she'd seen the attendant eagerly helping others with the same task. The pre-flight routine began, other passengers filing in, flight attendants checking seatbelts, the usual safety announcements, but something felt off. The senior attendant kept walking past her seat, giving sharp glances that tried to pass as routine cabin checks. Once, twice, 3 times, each pass seemingly designed to catch her doing something wrong. When the drink service began, the attendant's approach to different passengers told its own story. "Good morning, sir. Would you care for champagne?" to the gentleman across the aisle. "Our selection of fresh juices is exceptional today," to the woman in front. But when she reached 2A, her tone shifted dramatically. "Anything to drink?" Short, clipped, almost challenging. Our CEO ordered a simple sparkling water, maintaining her composure despite the growing discomfort of the situation. She'd been here before, in high-end stores, at exclusive restaurants, in corporate boardrooms. That familiar feeling when someone decided, based on a single glance, that she didn't belong. She pulled out her laptop, intending to review some presentations for her New York meetings, but she could feel the flight attendant's eyes boring into her every few minutes. The woman seemed to be looking for any excuse, any small reason to validate her obvious prejudice. Little did the flight attendant know that the quiet passenger in 2A had just closed a multi-billion-dollar deal the previous day, that her company's technology was probably powering half the devices being used in the first-class cabin, or that she sat on the board of several major corporations, including, ironically, this very airline. But for now, she simply sat there, sipping her sparkling water, responding to emails, and preparing herself for what she suspected would be a very long 6-hour flight. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the best response to prejudice was simply to exist, to succeed, to maintain dignity in the face of ignorance. However, she also knew when to stand her ground, and if this flight attendant's behavior escalated, she was more than prepared to do exactly that. The seatbelt sign dinged off. And as other passengers settled in comfortably with their drinks and entertainment systems, our CEO couldn't help but wonder how many other travelers had faced similar treatment on their journeys. The thought strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about one uncomfortable flight anymore. Sometimes, she realized, moments like these became catalysts for necessary change. 20 minutes into the flight to New York, the tension in first class had become almost palpable. The senior flight attendant's footsteps seemed to grow heavier with each pass by seat 2A, where our CEO continued working quietly on her laptop. The cabin lights had dimmed for those wanting to rest, but there would be no peace on this morning flight. For the third time since takeoff, the flight attendant's shadow loomed over the CEO's laptop screen. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw attention from nearby passengers. "I need to verify your boarding pass again." The CEO looked up from her screen, where she'd been reviewing quarterly projections. Several passengers nearby paused their movies or lowered their newspapers, sensing the unnecessary confrontation brewing. This was becoming a show, and everyone knew it. "Is there a particular reason you need to see it again?" The CEO asked softly, her voice steady and professional. She'd handled countless challenging boardroom situations, but this felt different, more personal, more raw. "It's standard procedure," the attendant replied sharply, though everyone within earshot knew it wasn't. The businessman across the aisle, who hadn't been asked for his boarding pass even once, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The CEO reached into her blazer pocket and produced the boarding pass once more. As she held it out, a business card from her recent tech conference slipped out, the one with her executive title clearly printed below her name. The attendant's eyes flickered to the card, but her expression only hardened. "Is there an attitude problem here?" the attendant demanded, ignoring the boarding pass entirely now. Her voice had risen another notch, ensuring that even passengers wearing headphones were now tuning in to the unfolding drama. "No," the CEO replied calmly, though her heart was pounding. "I'm simply trying to understand why I'm being asked repeatedly for documentation that no other passenger seems to need." A young woman 2 rows ahead had pulled out her phone, discreetly beginning to record. Others were watching with growing discomfort, some exchanging knowing glances. They'd seen this story before, though usually not quite so blatantly. "I won't tolerate disruptive behavior in first class," the attendant announced loudly, as if addressing the entire cabin. "This is a premium section of the aircraft, and we have certain standards." The irony of her words hung heavy in the air. The CEO, dressed in designer clothes and working on a laptop worth more than most people's monthly salary, merely raised an eyebrow. "Unaware of the standards," she said quietly. "I'm sitting here working quietly, just like everyone else." But the attendant was on a mission now. "If you can't maintain the appropriate demeanor for first class, we can certainly find you a more suitable seat in economy." The threat was clear, and so was the prejudice behind it. More phones had come out now. An elderly gentleman across the aisle shook his head in disapproval, not at the CEO, but at the attendant's behavior. A woman in the row behind whispered something to her seatmate about recording everything. The CEO closed her laptop slowly, deliberately. She'd spent years building one of the world's most innovative tech companies, had faced down hostile takeover attempts and skeptical investors. She'd broken barriers and shattered glass ceilings. But here she was, being threatened with removal from her rightful seat because someone decided she didn't fit their image of a first-class passenger. "I'd like to speak to the flight purser," she requested, her voice remaining professional but firm. She'd given the attendant every chance to correct her behavior, to recognize her own bias, to simply do her job properly. "Oh, I'll get the purser," the attendant replied, almost eagerly. "And we'll see about that attitude of yours." She strode off toward the front of the cabin, clearly expecting this to end in her favor. The CEO sat there, straight-backed and dignified, as murmurs rippled through the cabin. A gentleman in a business suit leaned over from his seat. "I've got the whole thing on video," he offered quietly. "This is completely unacceptable." She nodded in appreciation but kept her eyes forward. Her hand moved to her phone, not to record, but to make a call that would change the entire dynamic of this situation. Sometimes, she reflected, people needed to learn the hard way that books shouldn't be judged by their covers, and that power doesn't always look the way they expect it to. The flight attendant was returning with the purser in tow, a triumphant look on her face, but in moments that expression would change dramatically. Because while she'd been focused on trying to humiliate one passenger, she'd failed to realize just who that passenger was and the storm she brought upon herself. The flight purser, a tall man with graying temples and a concerned expression, approached seat 2A with measured steps. Behind him, the senior flight attendant practically buzzed with anticipation, clearly expecting swift action in her favor. The entire first-class cabin had gone quiet, with only the soft hum of the engines filling the tense atmosphere. "Ma'am," the purser began diplomatically, "I understand there's been some confusion about your seating assignment." His tone was professional but cautious, already sensing that something about this situation wasn't quite right. The CEO looked up from her phone, where she'd been typing a brief message. "There's no confusion about my seating assignment," she replied evenly. "The confusion seems to be about why I'm being repeatedly harassed despite sitting quietly and working." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The businessman who had been recording the earlier interaction spoke up. "She's been treated absolutely shamefully," he said, his voice carrying authority. "I've been flying this route weekly for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like this." The flight attendant cut in, her voice sharp. "This passenger has been displaying an uncooperative attitude since boarding. I've simply been trying to maintain our first-class standards." "By checking my boarding pass 3 times?" The CEO interrupted calmly. "By suggesting I move to economy despite my assigned seat. Please, explain these standards you're so concerned about." More phones appeared, recording the scene. A young woman in the row behind whispered to her seatmate, "This is going straight to social media. People need to see this." The purser glanced between the CEO and the flight attendant, clearly trying to assess the situation. The CEO's quiet confidence and the other passengers' supportive murmurs were telling their own story. "If you continue to be disruptive," the flight attendant pressed on, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, "we may need to divert the flight." She looked to the purser for support, but his expression had grown increasingly worried. "Divert the flight?" A passenger 2 rows back couldn't contain their disbelief. "For what?" "Sitting quietly and working." The CEO reached for her phone again, this time with clear purpose. "Before you make that decision," she said quietly, "I think there's a call I need to make." Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. The flight attendant scoffed. "Oh, you're going to call someone? Who exactly do you think?" "The airline's CEO," came the calm reply. "He sits on my company's board of directors. But first, I'm calling my legal team." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The flight attendant's face went from flushed with authority to pale with realization. The purser's eyes widened as he finally took a proper look at the passenger his colleague had been harassing. "That won't be Nick," the flight attendant started to say, but the CEO was already dialing, putting the phone on speaker. The cabin fell silent as it rang. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Corporate Legal Office, how can I?" "This is your CEO," she said clearly. "I'm currently on Flight 2187 to New York, and I need to document an ongoing situation of harassment and discrimination." The purser stepped forward quickly, his hand raised in a placating gesture. "Ma'am, I apologize sincerely. We can certainly resolve this without." "I've given every opportunity for this to be resolved professionally," she replied, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel. "But when your flight attendant threatens to divert a plane rather than acknowledge her bias, it becomes a corporate issue." The legal team member on the phone was already taking notes, their typing audible through the speaker. The flight attendant had backed away slightly, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. A young professional seated nearby leaned forward. "I have the whole interaction recorded, starting from the second boarding pass check. I'd be happy to provide that as evidence." "So do I," added another passenger. "And I," came a third voice. The purser turned to the flight attendant. "Please return to the galley. We'll discuss this later." His tone left no room for argument. As the flight attendant retreated, visibly shaken, the CEO continued her phone conversation, providing clear, precise details of everything that had transpired. The other passengers listened intently, many nodding as she recounted the events they'd witnessed. The CEO hadn't wanted this confrontation. She'd tried to avoid it with patience and professionalism. But sometimes, she knew, you had to stand your ground not just for yourself, but for everyone else who might face the same treatment without having the power to fight back. The purser remained standing nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the CEO detailed the multiple instances of discriminatory behavior to her legal team. He knew, as did everyone in the cabin, that this incident would have consequences far beyond this single flight. As she ended the call, the CEO looked up at the purser. "I think," she said quietly, "we're going to need to discuss some changes in your staff training programs." The purser nodded quickly, knowing full well that this suggestion wasn't really a suggestion at all. The rest of the first-class cabin had begun to buzz with quiet conversations, passengers discussing what they'd witnessed and sharing their recordings. This incident would soon become more than just an isolated case of discrimination. It would become a catalyst for change. The hum of the aircraft engines seemed to fade into the background as the CEO held her phone, speaker on, in full view of everyone nearby. Her legal team was still on the line, but she was now dialing a second number, one that would change everything about this situation. "Put me through to the airline CEO, please," she said to her assistant who had picked up immediately. "Tell him it's urgent." The purser, still standing nearby, shifted nervously from foot to foot. Within moments, a deep voice filled the cabin. "I was just heading into a board meeting. What's going on?" "I'm on Flight 2187, the CEO began calmly. "I need to discuss some concerning behavior from your staff." Her voice remained professional, but there was no missing the authority it carried. "You're on 2187 right now?" The airline CEO asked, suddenly alert. "Aren't you supposed to be joining us for the strategy meeting this afternoon?" "That's correct," she replied, "though your senior flight attendant seems determined to prevent that by trying to remove me from my first-class seat or potentially divert the flight." There was a moment of dead silence on the line. "Then, she's trying to do what?" The flight attendant, who had been hovering at the edge of the scene, seemed to physically deflate as the reality of her situation sank in. The passenger she'd been harassing wasn't just any business traveler. She was one of the most powerful executives in the tech industry and a board member of the very airline she worked for. "I've spent the last hour being repeatedly asked to verify my right to sit in first class," the CEO continued, her voice clear and measured. "Your staff member has checked my boarding pass 3 times, suggested I belong in economy, accused me of having an attitude problem, and is now threatening to divert the flight. All while I've been sitting quietly, working on my laptop." The airline CEO's response was immediate and sharp. "Is the purser there?" "Standing right next to me," she replied. "Put him on." The purser took the phone with slightly trembling hands. "Yes, sir." His professional demeanor cracked slightly as he listened to what was clearly a very direct set of instructions. Meanwhile, other passengers were still recording everything. A woman in her 40s leaned forward from the row behind. "I've got the whole thing on video, including when she threatened to move you to economy. My daughter runs a popular social media channel. This kind of thing needs to be exposed." The CEO nodded in acknowledgement but kept her attention on the situation at hand. The purser was still listening to his boss, his face growing paler by the minute. "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir," he said finally, handing the phone back to the CEO. The airline CEO's voice was full of barely contained anger when he spoke again. "I want to personally apologize for this completely unacceptable situation. The flight attendant will be removed from duty immediately. We'll discuss this in detail at the board meeting this afternoon." Several nearby passengers exchanged satisfied looks. The flight attendant, hearing her fate pronounced so publicly, looked as though she might faint. "We also need to talk about your diversity training programs," the CEO added firmly. "This isn't just about one incident or one employee. This is a systemic issue that needs addressing." "Absolutely," the airline CEO agreed quickly. "I want you to lead that conversation at the board meeting. This is exactly why we needed someone with your experience on our board." After ending the call, the CEO turned to the purser. "I believe your CEO gave you some instructions." He nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I'll handle it right away." He turned to the flight attendant, who had been standing frozen in place. "Please come with me." As they walked away, the first-class cabin broke into quiet but intense conversations. A gentleman in a business suit spoke up from across the aisle. "That was masterfully handled. I've seen similar situations before, but never someone with the power to actually do something about it." The CEO smiled slightly. "Power comes with responsibility. Sometimes that means taking a stand, not just for yourself, but for everyone who might face the same treatment." An older woman 2 rows up turned around. "My granddaughter is studying computer science. She needs to hear this story, needs to know that things can change, that sometimes justice does prevail." The rest of the cabin crew, having heard about the situation, suddenly became almost comically attentive to the CEO's needs. But she simply returned to her work, pausing only to send a quick email to her legal team about implementing wider changes across the airline industry. The incident had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would be felt for years to come. As the plane continued its journey to New York, the CEO reflected on how a moment of discrimination had become an opportunity for lasting change. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful response to prejudice isn't just standing up for yourself, it's using your position to ensure others won't face the same treatment in the future. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed completely. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago was replaced by a buzz of quiet conversations and the occasional ping of phones as passengers sent out messages about what they'd witnessed. The flight still had 4 hours to go, but everything had changed. The purser returned from the galley, his face showing a mix of embarrassment and professional concern. He approached the CEO's seat with visible humility. "Ma'am, I want to personally apologize for everything that's happened. We've reassigned all cabin duties. The flight attendant in question will have no further contact with passengers for the remainder of the flight." The CEO looked up from her laptop and nodded. "Thank you, but I'm more interested in what happens after this flight. This isn't just about one person or one incident." As if on cue, a flight attendant appeared with a fresh glass of sparkling water, the CEO's earlier request that had been so rudely ignored. The contrast in service was almost comical. The purser cleared his throat. "The airline CEO has asked me to gather statements from any passengers willing to share their observations of the incident. I have everything recorded," offered the businessman who had been documenting the situation from the beginning. "Starting from when she demanded to see the boarding pass for the 3rd time. It's all time-stamped." A woman in her 30s who had been quietly watching everything unfold spoke up. "I'm a corporate trainer specializing in diversity and inclusion. What I witnessed today was textbook discriminatory behavior. I'd be happy to provide a professional assessment." The purser pulled out a notepad, suddenly very busy taking down contact information from passengers who wanted to give statements. The scene had turned into something like a volunteer witness lineup, with people eager to ensure this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. Meanwhile, the CEO's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Her executive team had already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in corporate circles. The airline's PR department was scrambling, knowing that videos of the confrontation could surface at any moment. "My daughter's already got over 1,000 shares on her social media post about this," mentioned an older woman sitting nearby. "She didn't post the video yet, just described what happened. People are furious." The CEO looked thoughtful. "It's important that this story gets told the right way," she said, "not as a scandal, but as a catalyst for change." A flight attendant who had taken over the first-class service approached with a tablet. "Ma'am, I've been asked to show you something." On the screen was a draft of an official airline statement acknowledging the incident and announcing an immediate review of their training procedures. They wanted her input before releasing it. As she reviewed the statement, making occasional suggestions for improvements, other passengers shared their own experiences with discrimination during travel. A successful restaurant owner described being questioned about his business-class ticket on international flights. A renowned surgeon talked about being mistaken for support staff at airport lounges. "This is why what you did matters so much," said a young professional woman seated across the aisle. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you showed that these little incidents of discrimination aren't so little and they won't be tolerated anymore." The purser, who had been coordinating with ground staff via the plane's communication system, approached again. "Ma'am, there will be senior airline representatives meeting the flight when we land. They'd like to discuss immediate changes to our training programs." The CEO nodded, then turned to her laptop. She began drafting an email to her company's head of corporate social responsibility. This incident had shown her a gap in the market. Airlines needed better diversity training programs, and her tech company had the resources to develop them. Several rows back, a group of business travelers were having an intense discussion about implementing better anti-discrimination policies in their own companies. What had started as one flight attendant's prejudiced behavior had sparked a much larger conversation about corporate responsibility and systemic change. A gentle chime sounded through the cabin, the halfway point of their journey to New York. The CEO glanced out the window at the clouds below, reflecting on how different this flight had turned out from what she expected. Sometimes the worst situations led to the best opportunities for meaningful change. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her company's board members. They were unanimously supporting her decision to take action and wanted to discuss expanding their corporate responsibility initiatives. What had begun as a personal affront was transforming into a movement for institutional change. "Excuse me," said a quiet voice. Another flight attendant stood there, this one looking nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say, what happened today wasn't right. A lot of us are glad you spoke up. We see things sometimes, but don't always know how to address them. Maybe this will help change that too." The CEO smiled warmly at her. "That's exactly what we're going to work on," she replied. "Change happens when people at every level feel empowered to do what's right." As the flight continued toward New York, the first-class cabin had become something of an impromptu think tank, with passengers sharing ideas and experiences. The incident had touched a nerve, but instead of just causing anger, it was inspiring action. Sometimes it took one person standing firm in the face of discrimination to show others that change was possible. 1 week after the flight incident, the airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with activity. The CEO sat in the main conference room, surrounded by airline executives, her own team members, and diversity specialists. The atmosphere was focused and determined. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. The videos have reached over 10 million views, the airline's social media manager reported, pulling up various posts on the main screen. But something interesting is happening. Instead of just angry comments, people are sharing their own stories. They're demanding change across the entire industry. The airline CEO nodded gravely, which is exactly why we're here today. This isn't just about one incident or one employee. We need to completely overhaul our approach to training and corporate culture. The tech CEO, who had now become the face of this movement for change, pulled up her own presentation. "My team has developed a comprehensive training program that uses virtual reality to help staff understand the impact of unconscious bias. It puts them in the shoes of passengers who face discrimination." Around the table, executives leaned forward with interest. The airline's head of training spoke up. "The preliminary results from our emergency staff workshops are eye-opening. We've had crew members coming forward about incidents they've witnessed but didn't know how to handle. That's exactly the problem we need to address," the tech CEO responded. "It's not enough to just tell people discrimination is wrong. We need to give them the tools to recognize it and the confidence to stop it." Meanwhile, across town, the former flight attendant sat in her apartment watching news coverage of the changes her actions had sparked. Her termination had been immediate after a thorough investigation revealed a pattern of similar incidents. Now her case was being used in training sessions across the country as an example of how not to treat passengers. Back at the airline's headquarters, the discussion continued. "We've had inquiries from 12 other airlines about implementing similar training programs," reported the airline's partnership director. "They see this as a wake-up call for the entire industry." The tech CEO's phone buzzed with a message, another major corporation wanting to discuss diversity training. Since the incident, her company had launched a dedicated division focusing on corporate diversity solutions. What started as a humiliating experience had turned into a catalyst for widespread change. "The foundation launches next month," she announced to the room. "We'll be providing scholarships to minority students entering aviation and hospitality programs, along with mentorship opportunities at major airlines and hotels." The airline's PR director shared some more positive news. The public response to our new training initiative has been overwhelming. Bookings are actually up since we announced the changes. People appreciate a company that acknowledges its mistakes and takes real action to fix them. In the weeks that followed, the impact continued to spread. Other industries began examining their own practices. Hotels, restaurants, and retail chains reached out to learn more about the virtual reality training program. The incident had started a conversation that couldn't be ignored. 3 months later, the tech CEO stood on a stage at a major industry conference, addressing a room full of corporate leaders. Change doesn't happen by itself, she told them. It happens when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal, when we use our positions of influence to lift others up, and when we turn negative experiences into opportunities for growth. The foundation she had established was already making waves. Its first class of scholarship recipients included promising students from diverse backgrounds, each with dreams of transforming the travel industry from within. The airline had hired several of them as management trainees, demonstrating their commitment to building a more inclusive future. Social media continued to play a role in the ongoing transformation. The hashtag that emerged from the incident had evolved into a movement, with people sharing stories of positive changes they'd witnessed in customer service across various industries. Back on that same flight route where it all began, things had changed noticeably. The airline now had one of the most diverse cabin crews in the industry. Their training program had become a model for others to follow. Flight attendants wore small pins indicating they were certified in the new Diversity Awareness Program, and passenger satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. 1 year to the day after the incident, the tech CEO boarded another flight on the same route. As she settled into her first-class seat, a young flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I was inspired to start my aviation career because of your story. Now I'm part of the new generation making sure everyone feels welcome in the skies." The CEO smiled back, remembering how different things had been a year ago. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best changes. As she looked around the diverse cabin crew efficiently preparing for takeoff, she knew that standing up against discrimination that day hadn't just been about one seat on one flight. It had been about changing the future for countless others who would follow. The plane took off into the morning sky, carrying with it the promise of continued progress. In the end, the story wasn't just about one person's victory over discrimination. It was about how a moment of injustice had sparked a movement for lasting change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is using it as fuel for transformation.